Recording is on. Hi, I am David Kramer. I'm director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I speak to you now actually from my room at the Pearlstone Retreat Center in roughly northwestern Maryland, not so far north or west, but northwest of Baltimore, where JTS is now running a what I would call a revival session for rabbis to get together and study Torah, and I'm teaching them amongst others, and to have some good time with one another. And we're able to do this even despite the pandemic, carefully masked. But I'm only sharing with you where I am, so those of you who are accustomed to my backgrounds know that my fake background is not a hotel room. This is where I actually am. Eitan, it's such a pleasure for the library to sponsor you once again. It wasn't that long ago. It was before the pandemic, but still not that long ago, that we sponsored your talk on your magnificent book about the Zohar. And, it was really a privilege for us. I remember that I had occasion, because we were sponsoring the talk, to read the book carefully and to be instructed by it and inspired. And I've gone back to it ever since. And the reason I mentioned that tonight is because though many people will know the main title of the book, that is to say, The Art of Mystical Narrative, they may have neglected to notice the subtitle, A Poetics of the Zohar. And I draw attention to that because you are a person who is extremely attentive to the beauty and play and possibility of words, and that comes through inspiringly and with inspiration, movingly in the poetry that you write. And so this will, based upon my own experience in our conversation in prep, this will be a very, very special evening of poetry and getting to know you as a poet. Before we begin, let me just emphasize that please be careful to keep yourselves on mute. We don't want to interrupt the music of the poetry with the voices of the background. I promise that I am a very aggressive muter. So if you stray off of mute for any reason, I will quickly find you and put you back on mute. We will hear a variety of the poems in order to gain a sense of Eitan's voice, of the music of the poetry. And then we'll look at some specific poems in greater length. But we'll also have occasion to respond, to ask questions, to discuss. That'll come at the end. If you want to respond in the midst of the presentation, then please throw your questions or comments into chat. But do your best just to sit back and listen and keep your response for a later time, because we will have time for discussion. And if the audience remains intimate, then I think it'll be fair for us to allow for the opening of microphones and let people speak directly to Eitan and ask about the poetry and its inspirations. I said to Eitan, who is, of course, a colleague, a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and as I said a moment ago, a teacher, I said that the poetry is, in my reading, very, very personal. And so beyond what I've just said, I hesitate to expand on introduction because I don't think there's a way that one can capture the complex beauty of poetry. It's a very special language. And so I will let Eitan do the introduction himself. Eitan, please go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. And it's really a great honor and pleasure to do this with the mothership, sponsored by JTS Library, and seeing a lot of folks that I know, folks that I don't know. So I'm delighted to be doing this. And before I launch into reading several of the poems, which I think will be, as you had suggested, also is a central way, a deep way to take you into what this particular book is, and just to introduce it, it's called Embers of Pilgrimage, and is a book of poetry published by Panui Publications. Panui is an institute, a think tank directed by Rabbi Dr. Aubrey Glazer. Rabbi Glazer is an alum of our Rabbinical School at JTS. So before launching into and a scholar of mysticism and literature and a number of other related things. So before beginning my reading, just to give you a first kind of opening taste of my vision of where this all fits in. And David, you had mentioned a little bit about my Zohar book from a few years ago, the Poetics of the Zohar, and in many ways, the way in which I was drawn to the Zohar as a mode of poetry, as a mode of literary artistic expression in an academic critical sense, also reflects this artistic endeavor of poetic writing, of writing my own mystical poetry at some in many ways, but also mystical poetry, a contemporary mystical poetry that seeks to bring into interface let's say the transcendence of mystical imagery and experience and mind with the all too human, the deeply human emotions of life and mortality, of yearning, of memory, of hope, and embodiment, right? So in other words, how that mystical abstraction, or that flight of the mystical soul and mystical mind meets the very human experience, and in this case of someone who spends a lot of time thinking about mysticism, about the Zohar, and is also drawn to poetry more broadly, both to reading and to writing it. So I thought I'd start with tonight with the prologue, which is called "What is Poetry," which is a poem itself, and it starts on page 31. And this will lead us into, I think, some of the more mystical language and some of the more directly mystical language, but also reflects on my own ruminations in poetry about poetry. In the half light of the open water, he saw that all poetry begins in longing for what was, for the dream of a future that would never come to be, longing for the love of his youth, word music reaching toward a vague redemption, longing for release from suffering that is the fierce midwife of art and wisdom, longing for the curved light of transcendence that is revealed bittersweet in the soft shimmer of the gloaming, in the embers of the sun, scattered and sinking into the smooth face of a woodland pond? Or is poetry language reaching through itself like a ghost? Or a handful of summer grass, aching for a speech at the borderlands of reason and analysis, into the twilight paths of the mind, the mournful song of reverie, music of the primal flute and the lyre played at midnight by the Ancient of Days, the north wind delicately strumming like an ethereal blue guitarist, yet to be imagined by the Spanish painter. Sweet heavenly music waking the psalmist with a divine caress, the poet singer in the time before dawn, dreaming of voices mingled in choir, verse rhythm calling forth the first unknowing of innocence. And the echoes of the temple stones, cold and quiet, watches of the night gently pulling generations to the hour of morning prayer, to the liminal moment when blue and black are distinguished. Leaning into sound and the clean vision of mountain fields in gold and sweet green. It is love and the fullness of feeling, resisting understanding, reminding us of all that is good in life and what is unbearable, of the choking pain of regret and the transcendent lightness of hope. The artist seeing through crude masks overlaid, hearing melody as though hidden by the droning layers of dissonance, to the edges of the real, the cliffs of wordsmith wonder, hymn and metonym, language then like wagon grooves in the soft earth of wilderness, train tracks now abandoned in the grassy overgrowth. Poetry, made thing, and yet mysterious eruption from the blurred past of olden time, as though dreamed forth from the ethereal birth canal of primordial wonder. Representation folding back the cloth of ineffable sensation, crystalline and vivid, from out of the whirlwind of cosmic dust. I think we said just read several in a row, right? Right, David?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense for you to
Great.
give people, as I said, a sense of the music of
Great.
the poems. So let's
Great.
begin by laying a foundation.
Great, wonderful. This next one, which is on page 53, for those of you referencing the book, and it's called Light of Before, which has reverberations. Well, I won't meta-analyze myself, because I could meta-analyze the previous poem too. So there'll be time for that. Flame igniting, erupting holiness through dark lands of journey, divine light. Light that already was. Spark of before an arc toward that will be. Shine before sunlit origins, portal into knowing's unknowing, first point rising from the vast ocean of timelessness, sea of darkness, wisdom shuddered and then spun out like silk, past that is forever becoming, whether flowering and thriving or decaying and dying into the beyond that was before. Flame that is bound to the coal, inseparable glimpse of infinity, layered light, revealing and concealing the same. Blue below, darkened lens, cosmic table set, with black draped as cloth upon her, white light shining pure above them both, opening into the realm that lies within, luminal rungs leading to palaces of pearl and marble, end to end of the earth envisioned and held in primordial letters of fire, Torah word, illuminating and birthing all that will be, the is of becoming and future gazing, shelter of redemption dreamed in the near sleepless night, window opened from the airless room and rush of warm ocean breezes flowing over him like a rinsing of spirit from the pre-dawn darkness of the beach, hope that rises like a bubble of air from below the surface of water, alone in the wilderness. Let me turn to page 87. A poem that is called 50 Years, which says, for my parents on their anniversary. At the estuary of divine becoming, where 10 rivers of light flow from the mouth of infinity into the oceanic bay of universal birthing, where currents are unformed and reformed into the rhythmic waves of life, like the words of Kohelet, all the rivers running and merging into unity, and seeming fragmentation of being unveiled as one and undifferentiated. In this place of swirling waters, a portal is revealed, an echo of Jacob's ladder into the 50 ethereal gates of mystery. 50 locked gates whose wondrous shining keys were given with love to Moses on Mount Sinai, revelation of the Torah, a giving that reverberates and repeats eternally in the heart of each person in every generation. 50 gates, the highest of which overflows with a grace and compassion rich as the purest milk. 50 gates of light, glowing embers of primordiality, streaming into the souls of Israel again and again. For you, each luminous gate represents a year of togetherness. From that first storied afternoon in a castle on a hill. Half a century of love, 50 gates of love, so many dreams and roads traveled, generations spun out like silk. The loom releases a cool, smooth fabric. Children grown to middle age and new generations raised from that first love. Sparks of life that ascend, each one their own. They too singular, but conjoining in the fire of ever-evolving vitality, dreaming of what will come next, of hope and anticipation of things to come. From within the warm shelter of memory, a lifetime of moments wells up in the heart to overflowing. And so the flow of time here in this all too human world, where love dwells in these lives blended, love that reaches within and stretches beyond to that place that is above time, to the shining gates of Bina, wisdom, understanding, gates of opening the mind and even more the heart, to receive the river flow of infinity's estuary, drawn from the hidden spring that precedes all knowledge. Gates opening to unseen rooms of light, gates of the imagination, gates as the imagination, coming to awareness. Noda basharim, basharim ba'ala. Her husband is known in the gates, gates overflowing, and their greatest lessons are empathy and patience. Thus, the secret of the 50th gate, just love, pure love.
So wonderful. Tell us about them.
Let me just see. Let me just read for you. Let me just read for you a little bit from the Mystery of the Sabbath, if that's okay, which I think will also be a good prompt for some dialogue as well. Mystery of the Sabbath, and this is on page 41. Raza de Shabbat. Words inscribed in the moment of crossing, shadows and twilight entangled like lovers. Whisper of time transcended. World awash with eternity. Stillness, divine breath restoring at the soul of all. wrapped in the cool blanket of color, not red, not green, perhaps no color at all. Still and one now as it was in the beginning, when the infinite first overflowed like water from the hidden spring. All our days like pilgrimage to that other world, that day of days, me'en olam haba. Limit within time folded over into endlessness. Candle flame rising, spark of eternity erupting in darkness, all too human wandering in the exile of alienation, wandering toward death. Though I dwell in darkness, God is my light, radiance, revealing soul, neshama yetera, coming from the great beyond, now within. White cloth of chesed, pure grace, compassion, clear and flowing like a stream of youth remembered, just good, pure good. Force of cleansing within, mikveh of the heart, the wrap of rachamim, empathic harmonic wail, unbroken continuum of divine love. The garment of the soul on this day that reaches beyond the ordinary, the material, precious beauty and simplicity, gleaming delight of life within the earthly. But this day, with its orange and rose slant of light, the prophet of Amherst, heaven's gateway open as we walk the pilgrimage to Shul. Like Abraham of old, Lech Lecha, go now, walk the path, Artzecha, through the coarse land you send me, this landedness, a blessing and a curse. Artziutcha, he is imprisoned by the superficial, by the narrow. Go forth. It is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. Why this remembering of Egypt, enslaved to the humdrum repetition of the ordinary, a recalling of miraculous leaving, unshackled from the mind's smallness into the promise of eternity. And then home, absorbed into the smells of Friday night, family, friendship, intimacy, gathered now at the Sabbath table. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet, Malachei Elyon, angels of blessing. Do you come from that realm of light? Whisper of it to me softly. My open hands I place upon the heads of my children. May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, like Ephraim and Menashe. I can feel the generations before me, the blessing of my own parents and the gleam of childhood home. And like rivers converging on the sea, I can feel the generations that will come forth through me. Immense power, immense fear, futures still to be made. All is at peace. Shabbat shel shalom, the cup filled with the gathered wonders of remembrance and hope, of gratitude for the gifts of this moment. Kiddush, holiness, rushes in. Speaking words of wonder and the very fact of our createdness For now it is Zecher L'Maaseh Breshit, creation's remembering of worlds beginning from the multiverse stardust of mystery. Soul of the world, pathway forging through, timeless, tranquil, center leading to time beyond time, temple's gate and the inner courtyard closed, sealed, now the Sabbath opening. That too is the heart of man, of woman, vulnerable and guarded, now awakened to the mystery of redemption, to all that is good and worthy of gratitude, driven to heal the suffering. Otherworldly blessing given as eternal, ever-present pulse of life. Each day, the work of creation is renewed, always and unbroken. Maybe this is a good place to pause and to hear if any of the particular poems. I don't know if David, you wanted to start off.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me begin with this one. We could take some time to respond, and then we can open it to others and maybe go to another one for discussion as well.
Sure.
As you read this, I'm struck by two things. First, the similarity to the liturgical poetry that became the Zmirot, the songs of the Sabbath that are sung by some Jews at their Sabbath tables, and which in their words, Poetic, very distinctly embed awareness of many of the practices of the Sabbath. They reference not only biblical text, but midrash, rabbinic teachings, and legends regarding the Sabbath. They serve as a kind of commentary on the experience of the Sabbath, so that when we recite them, when we sing them, they actually reflect and in certain ways form our experience. And as you read through this, I have a similar such experience. I could imagine this, you'll pardon me, I hope it doesn't require forgiveness. I could imagine this as as a Sabbath song. One that actually brings us through and touches on some things we know. But for the uninitiated, it also touches on things that we don't know. I think there's a kind of secret language here as well. But I'm not going to ask you about your intention, because I very firmly believe what you said actually in your reflection on poetry. The first poem that you read, the line that I absolutely love is near the end, where you say, poetry is a made thing and yet mysterious eruption, right? And then it cites sources. Where does this eruption come from? But I don't know whether, the artist controls these words, the poet controls these words, or if they somehow erupt. But is this a poem that will enhance my Sabbath, or is it a personal statement of your own experience of the Sabbath? How does the author here relate to the reader? I hope this touches on some of the questions that are relevant to what you've composed here.
Yes, absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you so much, David. And actually, when I wrote that particular line, poetry made thing and yet mysterious eruption, I was actually thinking about a conversation that I had with the poet and translator and scholar of poetry, Peter Cole, when we were having lunch in New Haven, and this was long before the pandemic, and and talking about the question of whether whether the Zohar itself can be whether units of the Zohar itself can be understood as poems, discrete poems, right? Or whether right, in a very different sense from, let's say, some of the classic verse, very deliberate metered verse that became part of the piyut, and that was part of that grand medieval tradition. But that the Zohar is kind of more of a prose poetry at some level, and he was reflecting on the idea of poesis, or of right, of as the poetry as the very deliberately made thing, right? That the artist is making something of a very specific intention, and we kind of see that in relationship to, well, what's the relationship between that act of crafting something and how it's received, right? And we talk about in the study of literature the difference between the intention of the author and the reception of the work, right, or the textual reception, and there's been a lot of evolution in literary theory and literary criticism in thinking about that, right? Of which is more important, or do they need to be hierarchized, right? In the way in which interpretation happens through these layers of receiving these texts, or is what the author or the artist meant in creating it determinative, and so on the one hand, right, poetry is this attempt to, and I think this is part of what you were saying, is this attempt, at least in this casting, right, is to capture something in words or in imagery, to capture some experience, and yet also to evoke that mysterious eruption of the ineffable, right, or of the mystery of that which is of the hidden, of that which is beyond, in some way, ordinary words, or that which is beyond rationality, right? And I think in some ways, for me, and this is also related to my academic work on the Zohar, and it's also related to my artistic work in writing this kind of poetry, is that mysticism and poetry and other art forms share a great deal in common in that respect, right? That there's a kind of attempt to, in the case of poetry, of through language I'm resisting being defined by language, or through language I'm resisting being defined by rational thought. I'm gesturing towards some sort of ineffable experience, and so there's that element to a lot of this poetry, but there's also the very earthy, very lived experience of elements that, right, of sensuality, of death, of loss, of love, of generations, and so forth, right? And how, and embodiedness, right? So that there's a kind of this kind of meeting point, which was part of what I had suggested at the beginning, this meeting point of transcendence and the embodiment of the human experience.
Why don't we let's take a couple of minutes. Anybody who'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please go down to your reactions button and raise your hand first. Or if you want, you can put your comment into the chat, and that way I'll be able to convey it, or you'll be able to convey it if you unmute yourself to ask the question. You can convey it to Eitan. Dara, I see your hand, so why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead?
Oh, hi. It was lovely listening to your poetry. And I just have one comment. I found it surprising. I remember there was one quote, well, I'm not quoting you properly, I'm sure, but where you talked about suffering being the midwife of poetry, I believe. And that really spoke to me as a writer myself, as a poet myself. But then your poetry was so calm and peaceful that I was just surprised by that. That was almost an eruption of something within the poem. So.
Yes, thank you. And in some ways, that verse, those lines reflect a kind of other major undercurrent of this book, which is the intense force of suffering and of grief and of loss and how that plays out in a human life. An original title actually of this book long ago was Nostalgia, and there's a long poem and in here and a section on that. So in some ways, right, there's both a contemporary mystical poetry element to all of this, and then there's also the intense emotionally visceral elements of that attempt to put intense emotions into artistic expression, and that it is deep feeling that becomes that fierce midwife of art and wisdom, right? In the sense that we learn from the ferocity of those experiences, and that it is the kind of the birthing of artistic creativity. So you definitely have your hand on the pulse of another major current of this volume, which you'll discover as you read it. It's definitely bound up in my own, in those cases, bound up in my own experiences.
Okay, Eitan, the next person who has something to say is mother of Eitan. So
the subject of 50 years.
There you go.
You got a round of applause from Sandy.
Okay, Mona, welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to say that it's 52 years plus, but that's.
Well, I wrote it for 50
I know. I love your poetry, needless to say, and I love you. But I wanted to say that I'm really intrigued by this tension between the effable and the ineffable, between the made object and the flow of the divine light. I just think it's so interesting. I was having a conversation with the man I'm married to for 52 years earlier tonight about Boober, talking about the I and thou moment. And when you try, Boober talks about how when you try to articulate it, you're no longer in the I and thou moment, you're in an I it moment. So that desire to concretize and give words, which is ultimately what a poem needs. And then the fact that it sort of, then you're not in the flow. And I think your poetry really captures that oscillation between effable and ineffable in very beautiful ways.
Thank you, Mom. I would also say, and probably Jonah has heard me say this years ago, right? That Boober's dialectic between I, it, and I, thou, or I, you consciousness was so heavily influenced by Hasidic mystical notions of katnut and gadlut, of smallness of mind and greatness of mind, that move like in this mystical sense of a flow, of a flash of, like a flash of lightning. It's like Ezekiel's vision of the angels flowing back and forth in Ezekiel 1, right? Ratzova shov k'mareh havazak, right? Back and forth, like the appearance, like the visage of lightning, right? In the sense that we have these moments of inspiration, or we have these moments of sense, or of sensing the numinous of the sacred, or of radical presence, whether it be in authentic relationship between human beings, whether it be in the moment of revelation with God, whether it be a kind of sense of presentness to the world round about. That those moments of the revelatory are inherently evanescent and fleeting, and still so powerfully uplifting, right? And the poetry is it become, like other art forms, becomes this attempt perhaps to capture some of that evanescence, or to capture some of that fleetingness in that experience. Thank you.
Great. And Robert, your hand is next.
Yes, thank you for the poetry. Wonderful. So with regard to that process of finding the ineffable, how can you speak to your writing process? How do you go from the unmanifest to the manifest and bring that beauty?
Yeah. I think that right, in some ways, to go back to David's reference and a couple people's reference to this first poem, or which I call the prologue, this "What is Poetry," right? That the kind of genesis of poetic creativity begins in longing, right, or in suffering, to relate to what Darrow is raising, or in moments of spiritual inspiration, or of a sense of the sublime, right? That the sublime, which is inspiring in its classical, philosophical, artistic sense, but also mysterious and ineffable and fleeting. So I would say in some ways, and this actually makes me think of another conversation that I had with another fellow poet about the meaning of poetry. What is poetry, right? To some extent, poetry is also emotion in search of words, right? So on the one hand, it's whether it's to speak about the question of process, right, or it's the stimulus of process, right? It might be stirred by a particular emotion, or a particular, right, and in that sense, it's kind of emotion in search of words, or stirred by a particular state of feeling, and that might be wonderment at the numinous, at the sacred. It might be in a state of sadness. It might be in a state of longing. It might be in a state of rejoicing. There have been a couple times recently where it's kind of like happened at 3 or 4 in the morning, as creativity sometimes happens. Though actually the Kabbalist said, and this Jonah will definitely remember, right? To hear Jonah, this is a flashback. These are flashbacks to your time in the classroom at JTS, right? So that sometimes there's a thought that eludes us, and so some famous philosophers and mystics said that they said you should have a strong glass of wine and go to sleep, and then you'll wake up and have the answer, right? I don't know whether that's always a good solution, but that there's also scientific study that's shown this as well, right? That sometimes we might have greater clarity on something after sleeping on it, or we might have a change in our emotional process after sleeping on it. But I would say in terms of this poetry and how it wends its way between, let's say, some poems which there was some gesturing toward that in the poems that I read tonight, but there's a lot more of it in some of the other poems that I didn't read, which is speaking to Dara's question. That sometimes the torturous emotions, or even just other senses of emotion, right? Whether it be something that's rare, or that many of us experience, right? Or whether it's an ordinary moment, that there's a kind of wending or winding way between the ordinary embodied human emotion of that experience and my association to the extent to which mystical text and mystical imagery have kind of permeated my imagination, right, from spending all this time studying it. And so when I find my way through the processing of emotions, or the attempt to give artistic shape to emotions, it also will draw on a kind of dialogue with that language of the Zohar, that language of Hasidic mysticism, and so forth. So there's probably a lot more to say to that, but that's part of it.
So there are tools. The words are your medium then. That's your paint or your ink.
Yeah, I think so, right? So whether it's emotions in search of words, as I mentioned before, right? This fellow poet had articulated it to me, or whether it's the experience of breaking open the heart and breaking open the soul, that also brings with it a search for a new language. And that new language is also, for me, the kind of the brushstrokes of mystical ineffability, you might say.
Okay. You know, Eitan, it's incredible how quickly time passes. And we don't have a lot left. But I'd like to ask you about one more poem, which feels to me different than many of the other poems in the volume. First of all, I think it's the shortest. It's in one page. I'm referring to the poem on page 145, the title of which is Tao Shefa Grace, which I think is an ironic title, given that Shefa means overflowing, right? And this doesn't overflow. So that's one thing that sets it apart. The other thing that sets us apart is you actually use a rhyme scheme in key places. So I'm going to read it quickly, just to provide you time to say a word about it, because it's quite a wonderful formulation. So Tao Shefa Grace. Still the Tao, the Shefa, the grace, flow on and on with open arms and a half-hiding face. Your pilgrim soul buried deep within, how that one loved you beyond all age and gray. When you are old and gray and full of sleep, the Irish bard sang to his lover and muse when he was still young and filled with dreams. And like a stranger boarding a long-distance train through the Northeast corridor and beyond, those loves come in and out of his life, leaving their sweet mark of hope or their farewell like a bitter cynic in the night. Still the Tao, still the Shefa, the grace, flow on and on with open arms and a half-hiding face. I love it, but help me with it.
So, so there are a number of pieces to this. Kind of the centerpiece of it right, stanzas 2 and 3 are, that Irish bard is Yeats, right? For those of you maybe familiar with one of my favorite poems of all time, right? His poem about when you are old and gray and full of sleep. Right? How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. So there's an element there of me engaging, internalizing, rearticulating the power of that poem, but the centerpiece, you might say, or at least the guiding elements of this, right? These three ways of these three interreligious ways of speaking about the force of emanation of divinity, right? Because Shefa in the mystical tradition is much like the mystical sense of the Tao or the Christian mystical sense of grace, right? Of a kind of flowing force of energy that moves through the universe, that moves through reality and the human self, right? And it flows on, but there's a sense in which there's both the open arms and the half hiding face, right? That there's a kind of hester panim, right? A kind of hiding of the face in the sense of that's sometimes used to talk about the feeling of the distance of God or the alienation of God, or in the more extreme sense of why a certain evil thing or suffering happens in the world, but at the very least a kind of sense of concealment of divinity, and yet it's a half hiding face, right? Because at the same time it's also the open arms of the sensuality of that love of God, right? There are a few places in this book. Another an even stronger way in terms of playing with issues of rhyme is the poem Incantation, which if I read it to you, I can make it sound like a Bob Dylan song, David. And I know from seeing you at the Bob Dylan concert that we both would appreciate that. But it's right where I'm quoting from it, where it's split open and spent, where time is split open and spent like a dime, and infinity closes up its gifts with twine, right? That's a quote from that poem, which could be a Dylan lyric, right? Why not?
He did win the Nobel Prize for Poetry, right?
Yeah, why not, right? But yes, I think in some ways there's a kind of interplay here between that rhythm of the oneness of energy, that and at the same time the feeling of yearning and of memory and of regrets, or of reflection on one's life experience.
Thank you so much. I mean, our hour has come to an end, but there's so much more to read and so much more to say. I would invite everybody. I mean, some of you I'm sure have read it, but others not, and to pick up this volume and to make oneself familiar with the words, and then to ask you a lot of questions, Eitan, because I got to say, you just lifted up my understanding, and the whole evening has lifted up my experience. Thank you for sharing your elevating words with us. To everybody, thank you for joining us. And once again, we, the Library of JTS, provide these talks all the time, right? This is a rare evening of poetry, but we have many other kinds of books that we look at besides. And you are now, if you weren't before, on our electronic mailing list. So please look at the offerings we have and come back and hear wonderful authors reading and discussing the things that they have created. You want a last word, Eitan?
Just to say thank you so much to you, David, colleague and friend, and it's been. Thank you for creating this space for the celebration of books at JTS and for the community, and just a delight that all of you could join us tonight.
Okay, let's do it again soon. Good night, everybody.
Yeah.